This talk is about Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, where in English we read these words: "The women should be silent in the assemblies, for it is not permitted to them to speak, but they should be put in subjection, as also the law says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's disgraceful for a woman to speak in an assembly." That's my translation. First, we'll look at what these verses mean. We'll see there's a problem of understanding them in a way that fits their context. Then we'll go on to look at evidence that Paul didn't write these words himself, but that they were added into his letter at a later date. I'll be using slides, but you may also find it helpful to have your own Bible open at 1 Corinthians. Our first question is, what do these verses mean? Puzzling over them, together with the verses either side of them, pastor and Bible teacher David Pawson wrote these words: "It would be foolish to deny that this is a difficult passage, even to understand, never mind integrate. The writer confesses to having found no fully satisfying exposition, but is comforted by the fact that no one else has either." That was in 1988. Many different suggestions have been made about what these two verses mean. For example, that Paul really meant only to prohibit women from asking questions in the public assembly of the church, or that he really meant only to ban women from noisy and disruptive chatter, or that he was prohibiting only women's speaking in tongues, or prohibiting only women's evaluations of prophecies, or prohibiting only false teaching by women, or prohibiting only uneducated contributions from women. There are many factors which make these verses difficult to understand and integrate in their context where they stand in Paul's letter. In this talk, I want to draw attention to just three of those factors. If we think of the different suggestions as safe harbors into which commentators have tried to sail their interpretive boat, the first difficulty that I want to draw attention to is a strong headwind that hampers progress. And the second difficulty is a jagged rock that holds the boat below the waterline so that it sinks without ever reaching a harbor. The headwind is the context in Paul's letter. The rock that sinks the boat is the exact wording of the verses. So let's start with the headwind of context. In chapter 11 of this letter, Paul gives explicit instructions about both men and women praying aloud and prophesying when the church meets together. In chapter 12, he explains about spiritual gifts being distributed by the Spirit of God, so that different people in the church have different gifts, and all should exercise their gifts for the good of the whole body. In his explanations, he makes no distinction between men and women, or between men's and women's gifts. The gifts which he mentions include speaking gifts, such as teaching and prophecy. In chapter 13, he emphasizes the importance of Christian love. Gifts should be exercised in a loving manner. In chapter 14, from verse 1 to verse 33, he gives further instructions about how to exercise gifts in the assembly in a manner which will build up the church. Verses 26 and 29 say this: "What then shall we say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, each of you has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be built up. 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said." The whole thrust before verse 34 of chapter 14 is that Paul positively wants all believers to exercise their spiritual gifts, but in a proper manner. before verse 34, there is no trace of any restriction on who may contribute in the assembly in accordance with their gifts. We know from chapter 11 that prophets are both men and women. So we can see that in chapter 14, women are among those who speak in the assembly, and one way they may speak is as prophets, either prophesying themselves or evaluating what other prophets say, weighing it carefully. But if women must keep silent in the assembly, as verses 34 and 35 say, they cannot engage in any of the speaking activities which Paul has discussed, whether praying aloud or prophecy or evaluating a prophecy or bringing a hymn or a word of instruction or whatever it may be. That's the strong headwind of context. It drives interpreters to try to find a narrowly limited interpretation of verses 34 to 35, an interpretation which only prohibits some particular kind of speaking in the assembly, leaving all other kinds permitted. Next, we come to the rock that sinks all of those narrowly limited interpretations. The rock is the wording of the verses. Let's go back again to the text. The rock of wording has two jagged spikes which sink the boat. The first spike is that silence is instructed in consistent, unqualified terms. Quote, should be silent, unquote, looks like a complete ban on speaking, rather than a prohibition of a particular kind of speaking. Now, as a matter of language, silence can sometimes be relative rather than absolute. It can sometimes be silence in a particular respect rather than total silence. But here that option is ruled out by what follows. Quote, it is not permitted to them to speak, unquote. That's a complete ban on speaking, not a prohibition of a particular kind of speaking. Then, quote, it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in an assembly, unquote. That indicates again a complete ban on speaking, not a prohibition of a particular kind of speaking. That's the first spike of the jagged rock. The second spike is that the prohibition on speaking is stated 3 times using a different phrase each time. To say something 3 times, using 3 different phrases to say it, was a standard and well understood rhetorical device. It was used by Jews, by Greeks, and by Romans. It was a device for giving maximum emphasis to what was said, making it as forceful as could be. So here we have the prohibition on speaking given maximum emphasis by the 3-fold repetition. If these verses had been intended to prohibit only some particular kind of speaking by women, the words of prohibition would not be consistently unqualified, and the prohibition would not be given maximum emphasis by being stated 3 times over. What should we conclude? There's a severe conflict between the words of verses 34 and 35, which are an unqualified prohibition of women speaking, stated 3 times for maximum emphasis, and the context seen in chapters 11 to 14, where Paul is urging all believers, including women, to use their gifts, including their speaking gifts, including in the assembly. There are other difficulties as well. A third one is the phrase that says women should be put in subjection, as the law says. There's evidence that some Jews in the 1st century believed that there was something in their Hebrew Bible which said something like that. But that belief was mistaken. The Old Testament law doesn't say anywhere that women should be put in subjection. So Paul appears to be referring to an Old Testament scripture that does not exist. Anyone familiar with the quality of Paul's writing, and more especially anyone who regards the New Testament as God's word, must view that with some surprise and discomfort. I started with David Pawson's comment in 1988 about no one having found a fully satisfying exposition which can be integrated into what Paul is saying in his letter. In my view, the absence of a satisfying exposition remains today as it was then. No one has yet found an interpretation which makes satisfactory sense of the actual words used when they're read in their context. You can find a lot more information in my book, Men and Women in Christ, Fresh Light from the Biblical Texts, where there are 2 whole chapters discussing these verses. The first of those chapters reviews at more length the different interpretive proposals that have been made and the difficulties with them. Now we'll move on to look at some evidence in Bible manuscripts that verses 34 and 35 were not written by Paul, but were added into his letter at a later date. It may help some listeners if I start this topic with a few words of explanation about old manuscript copies of books of the Bible. The Orthodox Christian belief that the Bible is God's inspired revelation only applies to the texts as originally written. So we want to be as sure as we can that we're getting our text from accurate copies. Obviously, before the invention of mechanical printing, scribes made copies by hand. Exact copying was hard work, requiring great concentration. It was not difficult for errors to creep in. There could be copies in circulation which ought to have exactly the same words, but which in fact had differences, variants. The need for careful assessment of copies and variants was well known in the ancient world. When there are variants, how can we know which versions are correct? Scholars look for explanations for how the variations came about. Generally, the form of the text that best allows an explanation of the origin of all known variants is most likely the original. In other words, where there are differences between copies, between exemplars, you're looking for the best explanation of what went wrong to create the differences. Suppose a Bible scholar is comparing 2 manuscripts where one of them has a phrase in it which isn't in the other one. The scholar will be asking, is there a probable reason why a copyist could have missed out those words? For example, were there 2 phrases which ended with the same word, so that they mistakenly jumped over the second phrase when copying? Or is there a probable reason why a copyist could have added in those words? For example, have they incorporated a comment that had been written in the margin of what they were copying, mistakenly thinking it was intended as an insertion to correct an earlier omission from the text? Some modern Bible versions have a footnote about the uncertainty of the text of 1 Corinthians 14. The footnote will tell you that in some manuscripts, verses 34 and 35 don't come after verse 33. Instead, they come after verse 40. So the majority of manuscripts have the verses in the familiar order in which they're printed in our Bibles, like this. Of course, the ancient manuscripts are not in English and don't have verse numbers. This is just to show the idea. But some other ancient manuscripts have them placed like this, further down. In these manuscript copies, the 2 disputed verses come after what we call verse 40. The question that has to be asked is, how could that happen? How could it come about that these verses are found in 2 different positions? Well, in theory, there are 4 possible explanations. The first possibility is that the way they're printed in our Bibles was the original position. Paul originally dictated verses 34 and 35 after verse 33, but in later copying, someone moved those 2 verses down to after verse 40. Most manuscripts are copied from exemplars which retained the original position, but some are copied from exemplars showing the lower position. The second possibility is that the verses got moved up. Paul dictated verses 34 to 35 after verse 40, but in later copying, someone moved them up, putting them after verse 33. If that's what happened, some manuscripts are copied from exemplars which retained the original position, but most are copied from exemplars showing the new, higher position. The third possibility is an afterthought. Paul dictated, or perhaps himself wrote, verses 34 to 35 as an afterthought. Because the main text of the letter was already written, the extra words, the afterthought, had to be placed in the margin. But when his letter was copied, it was unclear to subsequent copyists where the afterthought was intended to fit. So when the afterthought was incorporated into the main text, some scribes placed it after verse 33, and other scribes placed it after verse 40. The fourth possibility is that there was a later addition. Someone else, not Paul, wrote verses 34 to 35 in the margin as a comment. Later copyists mistook this comment as part of the original letter and added it into the main text, some in one position and some in the other. Now let's consider the first pair of possibilities, numbers 1 and 2. That the words originated as part of the main text of Paul's letter, but somehow got moved in some copies, either moved down or moved up. In Greek, verses 34 and 35 consist of 36 words. Moving that many words in one block from one place in the main text to a different place in the main text is not going to be accidental. Scholars all agree that realistically, it couldn't be done without being noticed. It would have to be deliberate. A deliberate move requires a double explanation. The scribe who's in charge of making the new copy must be convinced of two things. Both that the words cannot belong where they are in the manuscript that's being copied, and that moving them to the new location solves the problem. Both of those aspects are problematic here. As far as we can tell from ancient commentaries, the relationship between these verses and their context didn't actually cause serious discomfort. The discomfort was only slight. That's understandable because in ancient societies, women were generally expected to remain silent in public assemblies. If the verses didn't cause serious discomfort, there's little chance of a scribe having an historically credible motive for being convinced that the verses could not belong where they were. But suppose we do imagine an historically exceptional scribe who had in mind that what Paul wrote was sometimes countercultural, and who read Paul's words carefully, and who was seriously troubled by the inconsistency of the verses with their context, that is, with the rest of chapters 11 to 14. What then? We have to imagine the scribe concluding that moving the verses from their existing position to the other position solved the problem. But that makes no sense. Such a move doesn't solve the problem. Whether you place that block of text after what we call verse 33, or place it after what we call verse 40, the problem of the inconsistency with the remainder of chapters 11 to 14 is not resolved. So the hypothesis of a deliberate move, whether up or down, fails the test of historical probability. Now let's consider the second pair of possibilities. That the words were first written into the margin and then were included in the main text of the letter in later copies, with the words either originating from Paul as an afterthought or originating later from someone else as a comment written into the margin. It's not unusual to see something in the margin of a manuscript. A scribe copying a manuscript that has something in the margin has to make a decision. Is what I see in the margin just a comment that someone has written? Or is it something that needs to be inserted into the main text to make the main text complete. If verses 34 and 35 were Paul's own afterthought, written into the margin of his original letter, that could possibly explain the variations of position. When something in the margin is supposed to be treated as an insertion into the main text, there should be marks to indicate exactly where it should go. But it's possible for such marks to become unclear if they're faint or if they get smudged or worn away. So if that happened here, when the letter came to be copied, different scribes could take different decisions about the exact position for the intended insertion. If the words were Paul's afterthought, that would also explain why we currently have no surviving manuscripts from which the words are wholly absent. On this theory, the words were always present, right from the time when Paul first sent the letter, so you would expect the words to be in every manuscript. But the afterthought theory faces the severe difficulty that the words seem to contradict the remainder of the text of chapters 11 to 14, where Paul envisages women using their speaking gifts in the assembly. And Paul is very unlikely to have made the mistake of wrongly imagining that there was something in the Old Testament law which said that women should be put in subjection. So we move on to the fourth possibility, that the words of verses 34 to 35 were an addition, a marginal comment which someone else wrote and which became incorporated into the main text when copies were made. We need to address four questions about the addition theory. First, is such a marginal comment historically probable? Second, would it likely have been promoted into the main text during copying? Third, does such an addition explain the different positions of the verses? And fourth, is this theory consistent with the whole of the manuscript evidence? So the first question, is such a marginal comment historically probable? Yes, it is. Think of it this way. In the early decades after Paul's martyrdom in Rome, about 67 AD, perhaps even before then, his letters were collected and copied. When Paul originally wrote his first letter to the Corinthians in about 55 AD, the assemblies of Christians were relatively small. But as time passed, circumstances changed. The church kept growing. The assemblies of Christians became larger and had greater public visibility. Paul had laid down a clear principle in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31 to chapter 11, verse 1, that believers should not give unnecessary offense, but should be imitators of Christ, who always put others' interests before his own. Within chapters 11 to 14, Paul showed how this principle of Christ-like love for others should be applied in orderly worship. For example, those who might otherwise exercise too freely their gift of speaking in tongues should consider the negative effect on inquirers who might come into the assembly. That's verses 23 to 28 of chapter 14. Outsiders who came into the assembly would be unlikely to receive the Christian message favorably if they were shocked by a lack of decorum. In an increasingly public setting, and in a patriarchal culture where women were not allowed to speak in public assemblies, women's silence could therefore come to be seen as a wise restriction with an evangelistic motive. To prohibit women from speaking in the assembly could have appeared as a prudent and loving strategy for diminishing social friction. It would make it easier for outsiders to receive the Christian message. We can therefore easily imagine that in the latter part of the first century, when Paul's letters were being collected and copied, a Greek-speaking Jewish Christian could have considered it important and helpful to write a comment in the margin, urging that women should be silent in the assemblies in order to avoid disgrace in the eyes of outsiders. This would have been motivated by loyalty to the principles Paul had laid down, the principles of love and of concern for outsiders. But if women were going to be silent, this would mean they couldn't even ask questions. Paul had taught that women, not just men, should learn, as in 1 Timothy 2, verse 11. So it would have made sense to include the suggestion that if there was anything they desired to learn, they should ask their husbands at home. Second question. If someone wrote such a comment in the margin, is it likely that it would have been promoted into the main text during copying? Yes, it is. If scribes were unsure whether words should be included or not, their general tendency was to include the words rather than risk leaving anything out. And in the prevailing cultural milieu, given the common wisdom that women should be silent in a public assembly, scribes who saw the comment in the margin may readily have assumed that the words were Paul's without being unduly troubled by concerns about how they fitted into the context. So they would have been likely to add them into the main text when copying the letter. The third question is whether such an addition explains the different positions of the verses. This is straightforward. An addition that comes from someone's marginal comment readily explains the different positions. If someone writes a marginal comment on a letter, there will not be any marks showing where the comment should be inserted because it's not supposed to be inserted. So scribes who think it's intended to be included won't have any marks to guide them and will make their own decision about exactly where to put it. Since there isn't a place in the flow of Paul's thought where it neatly belongs, scribes took two different decisions about where to put it. And now the fourth question. Is this theory consistent with the whole of the manuscript evidence that we have? I believe the answer is yes, but we need to understand how. Some scholars raise an important objection to the addition theory. I've already mentioned that we currently have no surviving manuscripts from which the words of verses 34 and 35 are wholly absent. The objection is, if the words were a later marginal comment, there should have been manuscripts which were copied from the original letter before the marginal comment was added. So we should expect to find evidence of manuscripts which are wholly lacking the added words. But we don't possess any such manuscripts. The main answer to this objection is, it all depends on when the comment was added. If the comment was added quite a bit later, say in the 2nd century, then yes, we would expect to find evidence of manuscripts wholly lacking the added words. But what if the comment was added at the time when Paul's letters were first being collected and copied? If it was added at that early stage, the absence of manuscripts wholly lacking the added words is not surprising. So we can say in answer to the 4 questions, yes, such a marginal comment is historically probable. Yes, it's easy to see how such a comment was likely to have been promoted into the main text during copying. Yes, such an addition explains the different positions in which we see verses 34 and 35 in the manuscripts. And yes, this theory is consistent with the whole of the manuscript evidence, provided that the comment was added at or around the early stage when Paul's letters were first being collected and copied. The addition theory is therefore the most probable of the 4 theories. That means that Paul was probably not the author of verses 34 and 35, and those verses should be relegated to a footnote in our Bibles. Many Bible scholars have arrived at this conclusion. Of particular note, the well-known evangelical scholar Gordon Fee reached this conclusion in his 1987 commentary on 1 Corinthians. It's worth noticing how much better the letter reads when the disputed words are left out, not being included in either of the two positions. In the last two verses of the chapter, verses 39 and 40, we have a crisp summary of the whole of chapter 14. Paul writes, "So then, my brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and with order." That's the end of his discussion of worship, before Paul turns to the topic of the resurrection in chapter 15. So it's clear that the comment on women's silence wouldn't belong after verse 40. But the discordant words also don't naturally belong after verse 33. When those words are omitted from after verse 33, verse 36 now follows on logically from verse 33. "And the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets, for God is not of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the holy people." Or, did the word of God go out from you? Or are you the only people it's come to? Paul is insisting that prophetic gifts should be exercised in an orderly fashion at Corinth, with the spirits of the prophets being under control. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations. Or did the word of God originate from Corinth? Or are they the only people who've received it? He's rebuking them and telling them to fall into line with what is done in churches everywhere else. Now, before we conclude, let's look a little further into the main objection to the addition theory. The objection says that we should expect to find evidence of manuscripts which are wholly lacking the added words. The fact is, there is some evidence that manuscripts wholly lacking those verses used to exist, even though we no longer have them. Bible scholar Dr. Philip Payne believes that he's found such evidence in a manuscript called Codex Fuldensis. Codex Fuldensis is a Latin manuscript containing parts of the New Testament, including 1 Corinthians. It was commissioned by Bishop Victor of Capua in Italy. The manuscript is now held at Fulda in Germany at the Hochschul- und Landesbibliothek. If you search online, you can view it without having to travel to Fulda. Philip Payne writes that Bishop Victor read it twice, making corrections both times, and noting that he completed these on May the 2nd, AD 546, and April the 12th, AD 547. His astute judgments, combined with his keen interest in ancient manuscripts and his privileged access to them as a bishop, gives special credibility to his corrections in Codex Fuldensis. Codex Fuldensis was prepared many centuries before our present system of chapters and verses, so it has a different numbering system which looks something like this. You can see 3 section numbers in the text in red for sections 63, 64, and 65. To make things easier to explain, I've replaced the Roman numbers and Latin text with ordinary numbers and with English text from the NIV. In the Codex, the first line of each section of the main text is in red to help the reader navigate. Section 63 is what we call verses 29 to 33 of chapter 14. Section 64 is what we call verses 34 to 40. In that section, I've shown the disputed words highlighted in yellow. They make up the first few lines of section 64. They are in the position which we're used to seeing in our Bibles, the upper position. Section 65 is the first part of what we call chapter 15. I've highlighted 2 other things that we should notice. Just above the bottom of the slide, almost at the end of section 64, there is a word with a mistake in it. Order should say orderly. I've shown it like that because there is a little mistake in the Latin text at that point. The other thing that I've highlighted is at the very end of section 63. There's a Latin abbreviation, HD. That abbreviation means that there's a correction needed, which is that something has to be inserted at that point after section 63. To see what has to be inserted, we have to go to the bottom margin of the page, where there's a corresponding abbreviation, HS, which tells us what to insert as the correction. Turned into English, this is what we see in the bottom margin of Codex Fuldensis. Remember that the Latin abbreviation at the end, HS, tells us that these words in the bottom margin are the text that's to be supplied at the insertion point. It's a corrected version of section 64. Bishop Victor indicated two corrections, a small one and a big one. The small one is near the end, where in English it contains the correction of order to orderly, which I've highlighted. In Latin, the correction is to add one missing letter. The big correction is that this version of section 64 omits the disputed words that we call verses 34 and 35. The text of the correction is only what we call verses 36 to 40, omitting verses 34 to 35. Bishop Victor of Capua is speaking to us across the centuries. He's telling us how section 64 should read when it is corrected in accordance with the best evidence that was available to him. He was a keen scholar of ancient manuscripts. We can infer that he saw other manuscript evidence from which he concluded that the disputed words were not authentic. We can be confident he's not saying that the disputed words should be moved down to after verse 40. That's not what his correction shows, and it can't sensibly be interpreted in that way. He's telling us that what we call verses 34 and 35 should be omitted from his section 64. In his judgment, Paul did not write that women should be silent in the assembly. If you'd like to know more about the manuscript evidence relating to 1 Corinthians 14 and about how scholars assess it, you can find a fuller discussion in my book, Men and Women in Christ, Fresh Light from the Biblical Texts. I'll finish with a few words about deleting words from our Bibles, because this is something that needs to be approached with great care. As I said earlier, the Orthodox Christian belief that the Bible is God's inspired word only applies to the texts as originally written, and that means we want to be as sure as we can that we are using accurate copies. So when new evidence emerges, it does occasionally happen that words get dropped from the text because scholars conclude that they are not original, but have been added. For example, 32 words have been removed from John's Gospel, chapter 5, at verses 3b to 4. It's also happened in the book of Acts in chapter 24, at verses 6b to 8a, where 27 words have been removed. We've been looking at 36 words in 1 Corinthians 14. The critical point here is the reason for dropping words. Words should never be dropped from the Bible because someone doesn't like them. Nor is it a good idea to drop words simply because they don't seem to us to fit the internal context, the flow of the writing. Some scholars and translators have sometimes proceeded on that basis, but it's not a good enough reason. It's not wise. The text is the text. We may think the words don't fit the context, but maybe we haven't correctly understood. So it's appropriate to be very cautious about this. Words should only ever be dropped where the omission is justified by external evidence. The external evidence is the manuscripts themselves with their variants, including any early translations and quotations. Words should only be omitted when the external evidence leads to the conclusion that the text did not originally contain the disputed words. Removing added words because of close study of the external evidence is not an ideological move. It's going where the evidence leads. When I first looked at the question of whether verses 34 and 35 of 1 Corinthians 14 were authentic, I was very skeptical of the idea that they should be dropped. It seemed just too convenient for those who were wanting to remove restrictions on women in the churches. But when I looked at the evidence, I was surprised to discover that the case for omitting those verses was much stronger than I had imagined. I was driven to the conclusion, as many others have been, that Paul didn't write those words. I now believe they should be relegated to a footnote, just like the added words in John chapter 5 and the added words in Acts chapter 24. Thank you for listening.